presentation.
My name is Zacharia, Lukorito, from the National Standards Body of Kenya. That is the Kenya Bureau of Standards. And we do develop the standards together with the stakeholders. I'm told to introduce myself to be inclusive. I'm dark. I've put on glasses. I'm aged 45, and I'm a male. Therefore, we do develop the standards. As a national standards body, that's our role. And during the implementation of the same standards, we involve quite a number of other stakeholders in that process. Briefly, that's my introduction.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Abebaw. I'm from Ethiopia, and I work for the African Disability Forum, which is the continental membership organization of organizations of persons with disabilities. Yeah, I'm based in Ethiopia, and happy to be here. Sorry, just to describe myself, I'm having black coat with white shirt, and blue jeans, and brown shoes with white socks. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I am very, very happy and very honored to be here with friends and old friends, new friends, in this amazing conference. My name is Michal Rimon, and I'm the CEO of Access Israel, an Israeli organization implementing accessibility for the last more than 2 decades. To describe myself, my barber said I'm blonde. Some say I'm a little brownish, light brownish, but long blonde brown hair, a white skin, black dress, and very, very happy with a big, big smile, usually. So that's me.
Hello. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so proud that I'm able to speak here on behalf of the Austrian Association supporting the blind and visually impaired, which I'm representing. I'm a white, male, European guy with gray hairs at the end of his professional life now, in 10 years perhaps, yeah. But I'm not representing only the Austrian Association supporting the blind and visually impaired. I'm working also in CEN and CENELEC and ISO and ETSI and all these standardization organizations which are working on a European-wide and worldwide basis, and that's the reason why I'm here. I'm thinking to speak about all these topics. Thank you.
I will start off by first giving a brief story on what we've done in terms of standards and how we are supporting inclusivity in our work. As a national standards body, I've already mentioned about our role as being facilitative to develop standards for ICT accessibility products and services. And we are also participating in ISO Technical Committee number 173 on assistive products. Now we do quite a number of work on these items. Moving forward, and how are we going to facilitate ICT standards in products and the services? The first step was for us to bring stakeholders together. And the aim of doing this was for us to have standards that are inclusive from the word go, developed by the real users, developed by those people who understand their requirements and the needs. Therefore, during the formulation of these documents, we did involve quite a number of stakeholders, and the key stakeholders were the real people with disabilities. That was the first step. So that when we were doing these standards, we captured at each and every requirement what they need to see, what they need to find in the services and the products they use on a daily basis. And I'm looking at specifically on ICT accessibility. We focused on 5 items. One of the items was hardware, then we looked at the software, and then the people themselves, we looked at the database, and finally the network. Therefore, the standards that were launched here yesterday focus on those 5 items that are really needed by the people with a disability. And we've looked at all those requirements. And the first part that we did develop was looking at the requirements themselves. How are they captured in those 5 aspects that I have mentioned? And then the next document that we did, which was part 2, was conformance. Conformance was to verify that actually those products that we've developed meet those requirements. How do you confirm? And that document actually looks at conformance that those requirements specified in those products. For example, if we are supplying a laptop, then we need to confirm that the requirements that have been specified in the first part are actually captured as required. And that's what you've done. Moving forward will be for us to see that these standards are actually implemented. Then how do we do that? Yesterday, we brought on board the Communication Authority, which is in charge of communication in Kenya. We also brought on board the ICT Authority in charge of ICT services and the products. Therefore, we are looking at a bigger picture when it comes to public procurement, that the public procurement will actually invoke the requirements that have been specified in those standards when it comes to provision and supply of the ICT accessibility products to those people who need them at the right time. Thank you.
Yesterday, while I was having my breakfast, I came across a man. And we were sitting together, having breakfast. And I thought he was one of the participants of this conference. And he asked me what the conference is all about. And I explained that to him. And he heard the word inclusive, and he asked me what that meant. And I explained that. And he said 2 things to me. The first thing was, people with disabilities are part and parcel of the community. So they should be treated like everyone. The government, companies, organizations should have these people in mind, he said to me. And the government, companies, organizations should have policies that benefit persons with disabilities. And these policies should be implemented. He said to me, many countries have policies, good manuals, but they are only in the shelf and they are not being implemented. That is a problem, he said. And I absolutely agreed with what he said. The second point he said, any service providers, if they do not consider persons with disabilities in their services, products, information, and then they should say, we don't welcome persons with disabilities. They should put a signage so that persons with disabilities will not go to there to have their services, and even other persons will not go there. And in the end, they will not be successful in their business. So I just wanted to share with these 2 pointers that I discussed with this guy. I want to speak on 2 topics. One, on what organizations should be doing to integrate digital accessibility in their routine work. And the second point, what leadership is needed to implement the standard. So to talk on the first point, I think organizations, companies should first ask themselves, how accessible is my organization? Do I have accessibility policies in place? Am I implementing that? Am I having persons with disability in my mind in all the products, the services I offer, and in the information I share? So this must be the first question that each company organization must ask. And also, employees working in the organization should have good awareness about accessibility, a good understanding about disability and persons with disabilities. So organizations should arrange trainings for their employees to let them have good awareness and knowledge about accessibility in particular, and persons with disabilities in general. The other point, organizations or companies should make sure that their products and services and information have accessibility features. They must ask themselves that my products, my services are also benefited by my clients who include persons with disabilities. Because the services, the products we produce is for the general public, and persons with disabilities are part of the public. The other point, which is very important, organizations may have disability policies, manuals, guidelines, but the problem is implementation. So they should make sure that all these good policies should be implemented, and they should monitor that whether what is stated in the paper is being implemented actually. And they should also collect feedbacks from their customers, from their product users. This includes persons with disabilities. They should have the ideas, the feelings of persons with disabilities, what they think of the products and the services they provide. And the other point, companies may have too many employees, and all the employees may not be having good understanding about disability. So they should have the disability or accessibility focal point expert, who guides the accessibility and disability issues in that specific company or organization. And they should also do their best to be compliant to Article 9 and Article 21 of the Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Article 9 talks about accessibility, and Article 29 also talks about access to information to persons with disabilities. So I think they should bear in mind all the points I mentioned. I will come back to the second point later. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I begin, I want to say something. We're all sitting here in this conference, listening to people speaking on the stage. And I can tell you that if I've learned anything in the international conferences I've attended, is that many times things we present on stage look like, wow, and we're not really sharing the difficulties, hardships, the process it took us to get to where we are, and of course, the challenges that are still ahead. So bear in mind that if you're feeling like, oh my God, how are we going to get there? You will. The direction is good. Now let's learn from each other, just like I'm learning from everybody that I'm meeting in this amazing conference. I'll be more than happy to share what's done in my country, in Israel, and of course, also the bad things, because you can always learn from mistakes of others. So that's an initial point. In Israel, just so you'll know, the standards are basically drawn from the equality law, which requires the accessibility regulations, which sends us to the standards, Israeli standards, that basically is talking about the WCAG. So that's the Israeli standards for ICT. But what's more important in Israel, I think, is all the extras. Israeli law for accessibility in Israel, which was accepted about 2 decades ago, about the time when Access Israel started to operate. Basically, it has, I think, 4 or 5 very unique things. Number 1, accessibility is mandatory for all, not just the public sector, but also for the private sector. So this is a point that is very, very important, and it's true about all the things that I'm going to mention now. Number 2, as far as website goes, every organization in Israel with more than 25 employees that are giving services to the public, to the general public, has to have a coordinator for accessibility. Now that coordinator has to be published in the website, so people who go into the website can know who to turn to if there's a problem. Number 3 is every service provider that provides services for the public has to publish on the website the accessibility arrangements. That's also mandatory for all, public and private sector. And the last thing is, two last things, and this is something very crucial, is the enforcement. Enforcement of accessibility in Israel is big, okay? Again, there's good and bad for every thing like that, and I will touch on that later. The enforcement is there by law. There is teeth to the law. And lastly, and this is something very unique that we're very proud of, and I think I got my reputation as the crazy Israeli around international conferences thanks to this part of the law. In Israel, every service provider is mandatory annual training on accessibility. Everyone. Think about the taxi drivers, the coffee shop, the bank, the government, the municipality. Everybody has to go through training on accessibility every single year. And even the legislator, in a way, took what Access Israel has been doing all along. We don't believe in just talking, but also walk the walk. And we're doing a lot of experiential training. That's mandatory by law. At least once in the lifetime of a service provider, they have to really understand what it feels like to be a person with disability and get to know the person behind the disability. So those are the unique things that we have in Israel. And we were asked to focus on what the lessons. So the number one lesson, I think, the enforcement. The enforcement is something that is very, very important. It's not just enough to have it as a statement or as a wish list. We have to make sure that you have effective enforcement in place. The second thing, I think, is the fact that in Israel, it's for all. It's not just for the government. Hey, if we're getting used to using the website when we're turning to the municipality or to the ministry, what are we going to do when we want to order clothes or food from the supermarket? It has to be all the way. We still have to do one thing, and that will be my last point for this round, internal organizational software. This is something that, from my understanding, is not mandatory to be accessible anywhere else in the world. In Israel, it is, as part of the legal requirement for any employer to have adjustments at the place of work. That is something that we're not still there, but it is work in process, and I'm looking forward for that to kick in. Thank you.
Yes, I only can agree with the enforcement thing. That's the thing which is lacking also in Europe or in Austria, for example. But I want to go more to the basics. I think we have to distinguish two things. We have to distinguish the standards and the laws. When we have standards in many fields. In Europe, we have standards on electronic communication, on audiovisual media services, on public procurement, on websites, and etc., etc. But standard is a standard. Yeah? You don't have to follow it. Yeah? You have to follow it when the law refers to the standard. Yeah? And when the law refers to the standard and there is enforcement. There has to be a push and a pull, in my opinion. Yeah? It's not okay if you stand behind the companies and always say, okay, if you don't do that, you have to pay. You have to pay 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 million, so blah blah blah, yeah, like this, yeah. It has to be a positive signal also for the companies that they implement all the rules that are in this field of ICT accessibility. And as you said it before, I think all goes back to the 2014 WCAG 2.0 AA standard that we have as an ISO standard now. And the EN 301-549, which is now implemented here in an adapted form in Kenya, also refers to that, but goes beyond this, and that's the good thing. But coming back to that, what I've said before, I think there are two sides of the medal. The one side of the medal is the push factor. The other side of the medal is the pull factor. Yeah? And going back to the basics means, for me, the biggest problem I see is the non-involvement of persons with disabilities or organizations of persons with disabilities in the standardization bodies worldwide. May it be a nation body, like I can only speak from my point of view from Austria, the Austrian Standardization Institute, which is run and owned by the Chamber of Commerce, and Chamber of Commerce means the interests of the big companies, or the companies are behind it, not the interests of DPOs. Yeah? and may it be CEN, CENELEC, Centre Européen de Normalisation, or ISO, or ETSI, or whatever. Yeah? Because why? Normally, the companies are paying for the person sitting in the gremiums of standardization. But when you are in ISO, for example, and the meeting is in South Korea, and you are sitting, let's say here in Kenya, who is paying for it? Who's going to pay for the flight and for the accommodation to be at the meeting? And we have seen it's possible during COVID to make it in another way. Yeah? To make it in a way with Zoom, Teams, Meet, all these things we know each other. But let me say one thing. Standardization sessions or meetings or the creation of standards, you have to sit together. You have to meet in person, because you have to see what is the other one, what he's thinking, what she's thinking. You have to be able to go out for a coffee and to make a compromise. And that's not possible when you're sitting in a Zoom meeting and see only the talking heads on the other side, perhaps writing their emails whilst you're speaking about a standard. Yeah? And we all know these things. Yeah? And on the concrete things like what we have in Europe, I will come back in the next round. Yeah? I'll give back to you.
Okay, I'll pick up from where Klaus has stopped and quickly mention about the next steps that we are looking into. I have mentioned about the inclusion and the stakeholder. Standards development and implementation is actually stakeholder-led process. It is not led by the government facilitates, but it's a stakeholder-led process. Therefore, in the next steps that we are looking at implementation of these standards, I've mentioned about the laws that already refer to some of these standards. There's the ICT policy 2020 of Kenya that refers to standards that ICT accessibility products and services should meet certain requirements and standards which was a missing gap, and we filled that gap. But the most challenging part will be the implementation of it. If we do not involve the stakeholders at the implementation stage, then we are looking at a potential failure of the standards that we've already set. Therefore, moving forward, we shall carry over what we've done in the development phase, involving stakeholders, so that when we move into the implementation, they are at the center, at the core of it. And actually, when we start implementing these standards, the products and services being provided to the real users are meeting those requirements. And as a national standards body, again, we are looking at improvements. Standards are actually living documents. They are never static. Therefore, we've developed the standards, but moving forward as we start implementing these standards, any deficiencies, any shortfalls in those documents will be gathered and be reviewed for us to improve those standards. I've mentioned that actually the challenge is implementation. We've just completed the first phase, but the most challenging phase will be the implementation of those standards. If those laws and regulations are not obeyed, then definitely the standards will never be implemented. But bringing on board the right stakeholders, and as a national standards board and working with the regulators again, there are two things that we need to look at. One of them will be dissemination of these standards. We've developed these standards, but we need to break them down to the innovators, the developers of those systems that I mentioned, about the hardware, the software, the database, the websites that have been mentioned. How to interpret those standards into the real things that the users want to see or need to access. Therefore, we've established an implementation committee, and we've involved various stakeholders, persons with disabilities, together with the innovators and developers of some of these components, so that as we start rolling out the implementation of these standards, then we are looking at how can these standards that we've developed be translated into the requirements, into the real products and the services. It will be a more challenging area that we need to move into, but I've mentioned the first phase will be the determination, breaking down those requirements into tangible elements that need to be interpreted into the products and services. And then the next step will be, of course, now to see that those providers or those requirements are actually meeting those requirements using the part 2 that I mentioned about conforms. How do you verify? Then we need those systems to be put in place on how to verify those requirements that have been set in those standards. I did mention that during the development of these standards, we looked at various requirements. One of them was about the SDGs that apply to inclusivity, and I did mention about the SDG number 4 on accessible quality education, SDG number 8 on decent work, and SDG number 11 on socio-economic and political inclusion. Therefore, we want to look at a whole perspective on how all these requirements will be translated into those specific areas so that people living with a disability access products and services that actually meet their requirements. And I want to mention finally that the world runs on standards. Without the standards, the world will not be running. And specifically for the ICT and ICT products and services, actually they run on standards. We have just surmounted the first hurdle, and the next step will be how do we see that actually ICT products and services run on standards? Thank you.
My recommendations for the full implementation of the standards, I think the first and the most important thing is commitment and support from the government and other key stakeholders. The new ICT accessibility standard was born as a result of the commitment from the government of Kenya, the Kenya Bureau of Standards, the Enable and other key stakeholders. So it's very important to have the commitment and support. The next thing is monitoring and follow-up of the implementation. So yesterday we saw that this standard was shared with other key sector offices in Kenya because they are the ones responsible for the implementation of the standard. So there should be accountability for the implementation of the standard. The other point is awareness raising about the standard. You know, it's a new standard, so what is it about? What are the requirements? And what's expected of having this standard, etc., should be well understood. So there should be awareness raising sessions about the standard. And the other point is engaging persons with disabilities and organizations of persons with disabilities. We should have persons with disabilities involved in the planning, implementation, and evaluation of this standard. Because if we are talking about persons with disabilities, then we should have them with us to participate in what we are doing, and we need to comply to the nothing about us without that principle of the disability movement. The other point, experience sharing platforms are also important, you know, to see how the implementation of this standard is going and what corrective measures need to be done, you know, to have this standard fully implemented. So this kind of conference is a good example. The other point is partnership and collaboration, because I strongly believe that partnership and collaboration is the key for success. In one of the email communications we had with Esther from Enable, she said in one of the emails, partnership is a key that makes impossible dreams possible. Yes, I strongly agree with that. We need to partner and work together, join our efforts, resources, experiences to achieve our common goal. So we need to have all the stakeholders concerned in accessibility and inclusion of persons with disabilities. So we need to work together and collaborate, because together we are stronger, together we can achieve more, and together we can advance digital accessibility and assistive technology in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I agree with everything my colleagues here have said, and I think if I'll start from your last point, I think that partnership is very important. And remember, a conference is a conference, and it's very important, but the most important thing about the conference is to meet, to connect, and let's connect afterwards, because that's the real world. That's where the work really begins. So collaboration, partnership, totally. Regarding including people with disabilities in the process around the table, again, totally agree. In Israel, I'm happy to say that it is part of the law, it's mandatory. Again, you always have to remember full half, full empty glass. It is part of the law. There are those who are complaining it's not done enough, or they would like to be around the table, not others that are already around the table. But again, it's a good start. If I'm looking at the, again, as I said before, the positive things about Israel and the implementation, what works, it's, as I said, the legislation that is powerful. And we see in Israel that large and medium companies and organizations are doing it right. I mean, in general, usually websites are accessible, and that is very important. But as I said, let's focus on what's not as good and what we need to learn from and become better. So the bad side of the enforcement is that there are lawyers. I'm a lawyer, but put that aside. But there are lawyers that I can tell you during COVID, it seemed like they sat at home during quarantine and just went through, browsed through websites, found what's wrong, and as soon as the courts opened, just bombarded with lawsuits. That's something that became a real problem in Israel because while it is legal and it is an option, think about the effect it does on companies that are doing what they can to make it accessible, think they're okay. There might be some mistakes. They can correct it if they just are approached, but instead they are sued. In most cases, it's a settlement, and the lawsuits are, in many cases, are for profit of whoever is doing the lawsuits. There are other better ways, I think, to do that. And what it causes is a negative approach of the organizations who are trying and not succeeding. I can tell you that Access Israel, before the legislation, was able to bring on board the largest companies in Israel to become accessible, before the law even requires it. And we did it in a way that was positive, in a way that came and said, guys, you're not doing us a favor. We're doing you a favor, the largest minority in the world. You're working so hard for profit. Don't you want to profit 100% of the population? And through that approach, through our model, we were able to convince them. And I think that the positive approach, I think Klaus mentioned that also, the positive approach in many cases works better. And that's the not so good side of strong enforcement. Another thing that we have to remember, and I'll tell you a short story. ATMs in Israel, in all the banks, are accessible. It's amazing. Accessible for the blind, for people with disability, in wheelchairs, etc. The problem is, I think 5 or 6 years after they were already placed and operative, we had a training in one of the banks. And the instructor, the blind instructor, said, yes, and you know, it's really a problem that I have to ask for people to come and put in my code. And the bank lady said, what are you talking about? But it's accessible for you. And my instructor, the professional instructor, said, oh, it is? Because in many cases, we run with the implementation. We do everything that's needed. We put the technology, we put the training, we do everything on the side of the organizations. But guys, there's the other side of it. We have to make sure that the people with disabilities, that the elderly have the knowledge, have the understanding, have the tools to use all the good that we're trying to do with the standards in the various countries. So the digital orientation now for elderly and people with disability is something that we're very pushing forward now in Israel, and I think you can't have one without the other. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. In connecting to that, what you've said, I think we have to remember that accessibility is not a status. Accessibility is a process. When we're implementing accessibility in a company, we can't say it's black or white. There are so many shades of grey in between. And when we bring big companies, or when we bring companies on board to start this process of being accessible for all persons with disabilities, then when they are committed, they shouldn't be sued. They shouldn't be. They should be on board. To bring, we should help them to understand what accessibility means. And when I look at Austria, for example, the problem that we have is we only have 3 or 4% of all the companies that we have do have more than 20, 25 employees, and the other ones are small-sized companies. And a small-sized company, when they have a website and I go to them and I say, okay, you have to implement accessibility on the website, and you have to change all the things that are on the website, and you have to pay 10 to 50,000 euros only to change the website. They tell me, you're crazy. Why should I do this? Tell me where in the law there is the point that makes it mandatory for me. And if it's there, if I don't do it, what does it cost for me? Nothing. Okay. I won't do it. And the second big point, which is connected to that, is I think we have to see all these things with the standards and the laws as an ecosystem. It not stands for itself alone. When I have standards, okay, who certificates that a person who is implementing my website according to WCAG 2.0 AA really knows what he or she is doing? That's the one thing. So we need to have certification of persons. And the other thing is a company committed to accessibility according to the standards wants to show in the most of the times that they are committed to do it. And how they can show it? They have to certificate the website. So it must, there must be something like an ecosystem where we have the training for the persons which are implementing ICT accessibility. We have to have a certification for the persons that are doing this, or for the companies, and we have a certification for the companies who are committed to implement ICT accessibility, that they can show it to the public. Because doing good and speak about it, that's one of the best things. And why shouldn't they benefit from being an accessible company? Well, they are addressing 20% of the population, which is now left out from business. Why shouldn't be accessibility also be a professional consulting item, then tax consulting and all this stuff, and that's based on standardization, because there are ecosystems in other parts of the business and other parts of economy too. Why don't we copy this and say, okay, let's be accessibility a part of a normal business agenda, and there are companies working in this field, and they are paid as they are paid when they are consulting in taxes, not subsidized by the state, not as a social business, as a regular business. And this regular business is based on these standards, I think. When we see now in Europe we have the European Accessibility Act, and that's the last point I want to mention. It's always compared a little bit with the American Disabilities Act, but the American Disabilities Act is now in force since 30 years, and the European Accessibility Act will be in force on the 28th of June this year. But I think it's a milestone, because in this case we have the first time in Europe, and remember, European Union is 27 European countries, together with I don't know how many languages, blah, 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 We had 28, but UK left us sometimes before. And it's the first time that we have in the European Union a law that enforces the implementation of accessibility, not only ICT accessibility, also built environment accessibility in all parts of the society, also in the private part of the society. By also stating fees if you don't do it, yeah. But the biggest thing is that you are excluded from the European market if you don't do, if you are not accessible. It means your product, your service has to be thrown out of the European unit if you are not accessible, and it means you don't have access to several 100 million customers and you can't sell it. And that's the biggest, I think that's the biggest leverage that we have in this case. Yeah? Not saying you're so bad, you're not accessible, yeah? But if you're not accessible, you can't sell the product. You can sell it anywhere, but not in Europe. Yeah? And yeah, I want to conclude here. Okay, thank you.